You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. Now in the last few episodes I've been talking about relationships. So whether that's parenting or in your personal relationships, it's about relationships. Now, the one other area that I want to really cover is where most of us actually spend a great deal of time, and that is at work. So what is it that we can fundamentally do to encourage great relationships at work? Now, the angle I'm going to take with this is we need to understand that being at work is not just a bunch of individuals working alongside each other, that in fact what we're looking to create at work are teams. And those teams we want to have function at a fairly high level. In fact, as high a level as possible in order for us to be able to sustain the organisation within, but also to be able to deliver to our clients, customers, stakeholders, the sort of products and services that we want them to have. We don't want to shortchange them. So the question now arises, well, how do we do that? And, in organisational development and corporate governance, all sorts of theories exist around that. But one of the ones that I found particularly most useful, I discovered quite some years ago, and in fact have used in my work personally, and that's Patrick Lencioni's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it was sort of like it was an interesting little book that was basically a parable that went through, these functions or dysfunctions, as he put it. And it immediately attracted me because, one, it was fairly straightforward. And although it's received some criticism, I've got to say that a lot of the criticism is in fact unfair because, as far as I'm concerned, and you've heard me say this before, essentially a good model can be explained in very, very simple terms. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. In fact, most of the time, the simplest explanation, the simplest process is probably the one that we should be using. And that is definitely the case when I talk about leadership and when I talk about creating strong, powerful, great teams. Okay? Now, it also means that you've got to have the right membership to that team. So, we need to have people who are not necessarily, the best at the job, but who bring to the team a balance of their personality, their skill set, their knowledge base, and the capacity to play well with others. Now, unfortunately, in our cultural environment, that can actually be pretty rare because we have created a landscape wherein people who are very good at spinning themselves actually often end up leading people. And that very, very quickly creates some serious, serious problems. And one of the ways of measuring that and taking a look at what happens within teams where we might have a problem like that is to look at things like job satisfaction, morale, absenteeism, staff turnover. So those elements are particularly important. The other area is, when are people quietly quitting? In other words, they sort of just keep doing enough just to keep the bases covered. That can also be an indication of people being led by someone who's very good at spinning things but not necessarily at walking the talk. The other one is, how many issues of harassment and bullying have within the workplace. That's also one of the measures that I suggest that we need to look at from a leadership point of view. And, finally arriving at the point of, how good are we strategically, tactically, operationally? Are we actually delivering what we need to deliver? And in a lot of instances, the answer is actually we're sort of bits subpar. And and I would challenge all you leaders out there is if that's the case, I would start looking at, how the teams are functioning. Okay, so let me come back to this model that Patrick Lencioni put together and where he talks about the 5 dysfunctions. So what are they? Well, the first one he talks about is absence of trust. And that is where members are unwilling to be vulnerable within the group. Okay, so very, very important. The second one is a fear of conflict. And that is that the group looks towards seeking artificial harmony over constructive, passionate debate. Okay, so, that could be people pleasing, it could be covering things up, it could be, at times ghosting issues rather than putting them on the table and going, we need to take a look at this. I know it's uncomfortable, but we have to take it further. The other element that's really, really important in this is actually getting a sense of commitment. And so, one of the dysfunctions is in fact checking in to see if there is a lack of commitment. People feign buying in for group decisions, and that creates ambiguity throughout the organisation. It's got to be down to the wire. It's got to be to the soul, to the heart of the matter. We need to commit into that. The next one is avoidance of accountability. And boy, I think most of us have got stories of that in particular and seeing that in action. Now, we've talked about narcissism and leadership, and the more narcissistic we see people act, or the more narcissistically we see people act, the chances are the more blame is going on in that organisation. People with narcissistic traits have difficulty saying sorry. They have difficulty taking ownership for when things go wrong. And there is a tendency then to actually look for someone to blame. Now, in a organisation that is strictly hierarchical and not necessarily based on competence, but rather on dominance, this becomes toxic. It's a cancer that worms its way through the organisation and grows and becomes debilitating. So, what's the final one that Patrick Lencioni talks about? Well, this one seems blatantly obvious, but it nonetheless comes up frequently, and that is the inattention to team results. And certainly in my experience, I saw that often where, we'd come out of a meeting, we'd agreed on course of action, and then when I held people accountable to deadlines and so on, it got slippery. There was always excuses or, why that was difficult to do and why we couldn't do it that way. And so from a leadership perspective, it gets really frustrating. And the only way that works is by being tough in a sense, and that is not a bully, not harassing people, but actually holding people accountable to what they agreed on. You walked out of the team meeting agreeing that you would deliver this on Friday. It's now Monday, and you're just telling me now that you can't deliver what you agreed to. Now, I have no problem when someone comes a couple of days early and goes, I agreed to be able to deliver this on the Friday. It's Wednesday today. I think I'm going to have a serious problem putting that on the table. And so, there is flexibility, and I'll talk about this in a minute. So fundamentally, this is where we got the 5 dysfunctions of a team. So what do we need to do? Well, first off, we need to build trust. Now, in order to get to trust, we need to do one more thing, and that is we need to get a sense of collaboration, cooperation within the relationships of the team. So building trust then becomes the key. And it's a key in any relationship, but it's especially important at work. And unfortunately, there's a host of workplaces where people do not trust each other. They may say they do, but when it comes down to it, there is a reluctance to opening up and really being honest and be able to provide people with the feedback they need, even though it might be a bit difficult. And my response to that as the person being spoken to is I need to trust that they're doing that for the best reasons, for the best motivation. So obviously, conflict means that we need to look at communication. And open and effective communication is essential. Unfortunately, again, our principles often violated. Okay, so if I want to include some more elements that I see as being critical in creating great work relationships, then I want to firstly look at respect as a value. It goes without saying, but unfortunately, people often talk about respect, but they don't act respectfully. So you need to treat others with the professionalism that's essential in building positive relationships. It means valuing and recognizing each other's contributions and avoiding negative behaviors like gossip or criticism. The other one, as I said, is we need to bring into play collaboration, cooperation. We're a team. We're not simply working side by side for our own benefit. And encouraging a very collaborative rather than competitive atmosphere can lead very, very quickly to a lot better outcomes and a more positive work environment. So again, what are the measures? Morale, job satisfaction, absenteeism, turnover, and then productivity. The other one that I think is really important that we should talk about is the idea of support. So how do I do that? Well, that can happen on a couple of levels. One, emotional, and secondly, on a practical level. I'm not asking you to do someone else's job for them, but it's a question of how much we can work together to lighten the load. Providing support and encouragement to colleagues, again, is one of the sort of magic elements in building great relationships at work. So it might be offering help on a project, providing constructive feedback, or simply being a sounding board for ideas and concerns. Another element that I believe is fundamental is the capacity to be flexible. Because flexibility gives me the opening to being open to new ideas and perspectives. And again, it is part of the magic sauce, part of the magic sparkle that comes into play at work. So we want to encourage a culture of creativity and innovation that can lead to better outcomes. We want there to be an attitude of just because we used to do it that way doesn't mean we need to continue to do it the way we've done it. Because ultimately that aspect leads to adaptability and survivability. So, it sets up a bit of a domino effect along the way. Now, this is an interesting one. The last one I'm going to focus on is the idea of recognition. And for many people, recognition seems to come into the financial realm. And I'm not necessarily convinced that getting more money tells a person that they're valued and that they're recognised for their contribution. I certainly had the experience of being managed by someone whose attitude was the only time you're going to hear from me is when there's a problem. So take it that when you don't hear from me, everything's okay. And my first reaction when I was told that was, yeah, that's cool. They're leaving me to my own devices. I'm pretty good at what I do. I'd like to think that that's going to continue. But after a while, it was sort of like, I need something. I need some aspect in the relationship from my manager, from my team leader, from my executive to give me the idea that I am really on track with the whole strategy or the whole of the plan for what we're doing. So after a while, I began to actually manage upward, and I used to go to him fairly regularly and go, look, just want to run a couple of things by you. Now, interestingly enough, he sort of took that as that he interpreted that as me not necessarily knowing what I'm doing. So I then had to become very explicit with him and go, look, the only time you're going to hear from me is when there's a problem. It doesn't really quite work for me. I'm much better off in a tight, collaborative relationship where there's lots of exchange of ideas, lots of, communication. And he took that on board. Wasn't always perfect at it, but he certainly took that on board. So one of the things that I think is really important to have great relationships at work is that we really acknowledge the efforts and achievements of your team members. And if possible, and it should be always possible, celebrate together when the goals are hit. Now, just a word of reflection here. Performance appraisals are simply not enough. In fact, they're often viewed cynically by a lot of people. And I've worked clinically with people who've brought that up. I've worked with people within organisations where that's been an issue. So it's much more powerful when, as a leader, I go to someone that has been really throwing in a good effort to say, got a couple of minutes? Just want to sort of see what's happening and just a bit of a brief chat. But the chat is really about me, then fundamentally going, look, I really appreciate the effort that you've put into this. And, I have been paying attention, and I just want you to know that you've done a brilliant job. It's going really well. Now, flip side of it, I also need to be able to go to a person who's not doing that and say to them, look, we need to have a chat because we need to, come to a better agreement about what's working and what's not working here. So this are some of the building blocks that I see as fundamentally important with great relationships at work. Now, we don't need to be bestest buddies at work, but we certainly have to build in these elements to make work, both for ourselves but for others and the organisation, really hum. It's a bit like watching the Formula One and the pit crew. If we can get it down to that point, I think we're blitzing it. So have a think about this. Reflect on your workplace. See what you can bring to your workplace that's going to enhance that. Remember, it's not up to others to fix things. It's often up to us to bring it up so that collectively we can work on it. So any ideas, anything that you want to drop in, please by all means do that. And let me bring your attention to my website, www.goodmengreat.com, and my other one, which is www.gunterswoboda.com. And if you're looking for feedback, you're looking to get coached, you want some input on any level, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to make this a bit more conversational. And so until next time, be an inspiration for change. Don't expect someone else to do it. So then, until the next podcast, speak soon.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.